the night of November 23, 1943. The sky above Berlin was a living hell. Over 300 Avro Lancaster bombers from the Royal Air Force RAF were tearing through the night, on a mission to level the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Inside the Lancaster Q Queenie, Major John Jack Harding, a veteran pilot with 24 missions, tightened his grip on the controls. His radar screen, called H2S, emitted a faint green glow, painting a crude map of the ground below. But that night, something was wrong. "Skipper, look at this!" The radar operator, Sergeant Leslie Miller, spoke up. His voice was laced with confusion. "I'm getting a ghost." On the screen, right in the middle of the radar channel used to identify ground targets, a strange, hovering, and stationary blip had appeared. It wasn't a hill, nor a building. It was just there, a false echo, a technical glitch. To them, it was just a minor annoyance, a ghost on the screen. They had no idea that this seemingly harmless ghost was the key to unlocking one of the greatest technological deceptions of the war, a revolution that would blind the nocturnal predators of the Nazi Luftwaffe. To understand the desperation of the RAF in late 1943, we must go back to that time. The American daylight bombing campaign was paying a heavy price from German air attacks. Therefore, the burden fell on the RAF to strike at night. But night bombing at the time was like firing a blindfolded arrow into the darkness. The ability to identify and hit specific targets was incredibly low. The statistics were devastating. Less than 5% of bombs fell within a 5-mile radius of their intended target. The solution was H2S, the world's first revolutionary ground-mapping radar system. Essentially, it was an eye that could see through the night. It emitted microwave pulses toward the ground. These pulses bounced back from different terrains and structures, creating a map that could distinguish between urban areas, strong reflection, and countryside, or water-weak reflection. It was Britain's most closely guarded treasure. But the Nazis were not fools. In February 1943, an RAF Lancaster was shot down over German-occupied Dutch territory. The wreckage was burned, but the bomb bay was partially intact, and inside was an H2S unit. German engineers quickly collected the fragments. They were stunned. The British had developed a navigation radar. They immediately began to copy the technology, but more importantly, they began to develop countermeasures, and this is where the electronic war truly began. The Germans had deployed a tightly integrated air defense network called the Kammhuber Line, a barrier of radar stations, searchlights, and radar-controlled night fighters. The heart of this system was a pair of radars Würzburg to track the bombers, and Liechtenstein mounted on the night fighters themselves, allowing pilots like Major Heinrich Prinz zu Wittgenstein, a night ace with over 80 victories, to lock onto their targets in the thick darkness. The situation became extremely dire for the RAF pilots. They called it the 6-minute window of death. That was the average time from when a German night fighter detected them until it opened fire. The RAF's casualty rate skyrocketed to unacceptable levels, reaching 8 to 9% on some nights. Statisticians calculated that a pilot could only hope to survive 15 missions. Morale plummeted. Bomber Command was facing a strategic disaster. They needed a technological miracle, and that miracle came from an unexpected place, a technical glitch. Reports from crews like Major Harding's began to pile up on the desk of Dr. Robert Cockburn, head of the Telecommunications Research Establishment TRE, the unit responsible for Britain's electronic warfare. These ghost echoes, these stationary and unexplained radar signals, were initially dismissed as malfunctions of the H2S set itself. But Cockburn, a brilliant and skeptical mind, saw something different. He noticed these ghosts only appeared when the aircraft were in a specific area, the area protected by the Kammhuber Line. He asked a crazy question. Was this some kind of active German jamming? And if so, why was it so bad? After weeks of secret investigation, British scientists found the source. It wasn't jamming, it was a reflection. The German Würzburg radar stations operated on a frequency very close to the British H2S radar. In a pure coincidence, the signal from the H2S was leaking and being picked up by the Würzburg's antenna. This signal was then bounced back to the bomber, creating a double echo that appeared on the H2S screen as a fixed blip. Essentially, the British were inadvertently seeing a reflection of their own radar signals from the enemy's ground stations. Most people would have seen this as a technical problem to be fixed. But Cockburn and his team saw a strategic opportunity. What if they could amplify this phenomenon? What if they could create an active, more powerful version of this double echo, not to show up on their H2S screens, but to blind the German Würzburg and Liechtenstein radars? They called it Airborne Cigar, or ABC, but it would soon be known by its more iconic name, Window. And this is where the story really begins, because as soon as the idea was proposed, it met with fierce resistance from Britain's own high command. They feared that if they used Window, the Germans would quickly copy it and use it against Britain itself. The clash between pioneering scientific minds and the conservative military establishment would shape one of the riskiest decisions of the war. The banned idea, the war in secret rooms. In a windowless room at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, England, Dr. Robert Cockburn stood before a group of high-ranking officers from Bomber Command. On the table in front of them was a remarkably ordinary-looking object, a thin strip of aluminum foil, about 30 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, cut into small rectangles and attached to a paper strip. "Gentlemen," Cockburn began, his tone confident yet formal, "this is Window, the solution to the German night fighter problem." The principle was incredibly simple, a masterpiece of minimalism. When these strips of foil were released from an aircraft, they would float in the air, creating a cloud of conductive strips. Each strip of foil acted as a miniature antenna, absorbing and reflecting the German radar signals. When thousands, even millions, of these strips were dropped, they would create a chaotic cloud of false echoes on the German radar screens. The real bombers would disappear, obscured by an artificial storm of aluminum foil. It was the high-tech version of throwing dust in the enemy's eyes. But instead of enthusiasm, Cockburn was met with skeptical stares. The air in the room grew heavy. "Dr. Cockburn," an air marshal spoke, his voice thick with doubt. "You are proposing we drop tons of tinfoil over Germany. Do you truly believe this? This fluff can defeat the most sophisticated air defense system in the world." "Sir, it is not fluff," Cockburn explained patiently. "It is a passive broadband jammer. Each strip is cut to a precise length, half the wavelength of the German Würzburg radar, making it a perfect resonator. We are, in essence, turning German airspace into a giant mirror that their own radar cannot penetrate. No matter how convincing the principle, the real barrier was fear." An admiral from the Admiralty slammed his hand on the table. "This is unacceptable if we use this. The Germans will know immediately. They will learn to do the same thing within a week. And then what our fleet, our own air defense systems at home, all of it will be blinded. You are proposing to hand the enemy a weapon that could destroy us." This was the key argument. Britain relied heavily on radar for its own defense to detect German bomber attacks, to guide its naval vessels. The obsession with a blowback haunted the British leadership. An internal memorandum from the Chiefs of Staff Committee summarized the problem grimly. "The use of this measure will give us an enormous advantage for a short time, but will also expose us to disaster if the enemy retaliates." Cockburn and his team fought this fear with data. They conducted a secret experiment, codenamed Operation Bellicose Trial. A single aircraft dropped a small amount of Window along the English coast, while the chain-home radar stations were pre-warned to observe. The results were astonishing. The radar stations were completely overwhelmed. Their screens were flooded with false targets. making it impossible for them to distinguish a real aircraft had one appeared. The experiment both proved Windows' effectiveness and confirmed the leadership's worst fears. The debate culminated in a meeting with Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself. Cockburn's report was placed on Churchill's desk. It is said that Churchill read it intently, puffing on his cigar. He understood both the allure of a tactical advantage and the strategic threat. Finally, he looked at his military advisers and asked a simple question. Will this measure help us defeat the German Air Force over Germany? The answer was yes, and with Churchill's approval, a ban was enacted. Window would not be used until a direct order came from him. They would stockpile tons of the foil strips and wait for the perfect moment, a moment when the tactical benefit was so great it was worth the strategic risk. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler's engineers were not idle. They had noticed the strange double echo phenomenon. A brilliant German radar scientist, Dr. Johannes Plendl, had even tested their own version of the foil, which they called Duppel. But the Nazi military leadership, with growing arrogance about their technological superiority, made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the threat. They assumed the enemy would never risk using such a weapon, as it could be used against them. Germany's hesitation gave the British a precious advantage. That moment finally came in the summer of 1943. The plan was codenamed Operation Gomorrah, a bombing campaign aimed at annihilating the city of Hamburg, one of Germany's most important industrial centers. Bomber Command knew this would be an extremely dangerous mission, facing Germany's densest air defense system. They needed an element of surprise. They needed Window. The order came down from the War Office Window would be deployed for the first time during the attack on Hamburg, scheduled for the night of July 24, 1943. Hundreds of thousands of foil strips were delivered to air bases. Crews were given quick briefings on a new radar countermeasure they called rope. No one was to reveal the secret. The success of the entire operation and the lives of 800 airmen now depended on the effectiveness of those cheap strips of foil. The night of the strips, the Silver Storm over Hamburg night of July 24, 1943. The crews of No. 76 Squadron at RAF Home on Spalding Moor received a special order. Alongside their usual bomb loads, their aircraft were loaded with mysterious cardboard boxes. Weighing about 20 pounds, inside were thousands of rolled-up aluminum foil strips, ready to be pushed out through a special flare chute. Their instructions were clear. Upon reaching a marker on the map, codenamed X, begin dropping these bundles at a rate of 1 per minute. They called this strange task sowing straw. Lieutenant Peter Stevens, a young pilot with 76 Squadron, looked at the boxes with skepticism. "They're giving us tinfoil to throw at the Germans," he whispered to his navigator. "Maybe Command has run out of ideas." They had no idea they were carrying the secret weapon that could change the course of the war. At the same time, in the German night fighter control center at Stade, near Hamburg, it was business as usual. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Jochen, a seasoned operations officer, was monitoring his Würzburg radar screens. At 00:55, the first blips began to appear, signaling a large force of British bombers entering the German Bight. Jochen issued orders confidently. Allocate targets to the fighter wings. Vector them into the battle. Germany's sophisticated air defense system began to operate like a well-oiled machine. But then something strange began to happen. "Herr Oberstleutnant?" A radar sergeant spoke up, his voice filled with confusion. "My screen. It is dancing. Instead of clear blips representing individual bombers, Jochen's entire radar screen suddenly exploded into a sea of glittering white light. Hundreds, then thousands of blips appeared, spreading and moving, forming an impenetrable wall of electronic noise. He couldn't see anything. Operators at other radar stations reported the same status over the radio, their voices filled with panic. "Wahnsinn, madness," was the word shouted repeatedly. The nervous system of the German air defense had been attacked and completely paralyzed in minutes. In the sky, German night fighter pilots fell into similar chaos. Major Hans-Heinz Augenstein, a veteran ace with 45 victories, was flying his Messerschmitt Bf 110 when his Liechtenstein radar screen suddenly turned to snow. "Was ist das? What is this?" he roared at his radar operator. With no clear radar signals, they were completely blind. They flew into the clouds of foil, unable to distinguish real bombers from the glittering strips. The anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were also blinded. Their heavy 80-kilometer batteries could now only fire blindly into the sky, with no precise guidance from radar. As for the RAF crews like Lieutenant Stevens, the effect was unbelievable. When they began dropping window, they had braced for a life-or-death battle. But instead, the sky became eerily quiet. The German night fighters, which usually dove on them like hawks, were now flying erratically, disoriented. The anti-aircraft flak, usually dense and accurate, was now sparse and random. "Good God!" Stevens's navigator exclaimed. "It's actually working. Look, they're completely blind." That night, Hamburg burned. Unhindered by fighters and accurate anti-aircraft fire, the RAF bombers dropped an enormous payload on the city, creating a terrifying and unprecedented weather phenomenon, the Feuersturm, the firestorm. Temperatures reached 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, 800 degrees Celsius, creating hurricane-force winds that sucked air from the periphery into the center, crushing buildings and pulling people into the inferno. Approximately 40,000 people were killed in a single night. Militarily, the results were spectacular. The RAF's casualty rate during that window raid was only 1.5%, an incredibly low figure compared to the 6 to 8% expected without it. Only 12 out of 791 bombers were lost. The Germans called that night Die Nacht des Blitzes, the night of the lightning, not because of thunder, but because of the deadly sparkle of the foil strips that had paralyzed their air defenses. The success of Window in Operation Gomorrah opened a new era in warfare, the age of electronic warfare. But this victory also brought a new burden. Now, the Germans knew about the weapon. The big question was, how would they react, and would the British fear of a blowback become a reality? The electronic arms race. When the enemy adapts at dawn on July 25, 1943, Hamburg was a smoldering ruin. In the rubble of the night fighter control center at Stade, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Jochen picked up a few delicate strips of foil stuck to a broken window. He held it in his hand, feeling its incredible fragility. This is what had defeated the Reich's most sophisticated air defense. A feeling of mixed awe and fury washed over him. The preliminary report sent to the Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin carried a tone of panic. Enemy using an unknown jamming method. All Würzburg and Liechtenstein radar systems in the Hamburg area were completely neutralized. Germany's initial reaction was chaos and disbelief. Some high-ranking officers refused to believe that something as simple as tinfoil could cause such a catastrophe. They suspected some kind of secret British-directed energy weapon. However, scientists like Dr. Johannes Plendl, who had once warned of this threat, quickly confirmed this was Dupel, the very thing they themselves had tested and then ignored. The arrogance of the Nazi leadership had now cost them a city, but the Germans were not easily defeated. Immediately, an urgent effort was launched to find countermeasures. They had two paths: change the technology or change the tactics. 1. The technological revolution. Frequency hunting. First, they tried to engineer their way around Window. German engineers realized that Window was only effective at a specific wavelength. If they could quickly change the operating frequency of their Würzburg and Liechtenstein radars, they could outrun the foil storm. An emergency program was launched to produce new frequency converters for thousands of radar systems. However, this was a massive, costly and time-consuming task in the midst of a raging war. Every time they changed frequencies, British scientists at the TRE quickly gathered the information via signal sniffing devices or from reconnaissance aircraft, and produced new batches of window cut to the right size within weeks. A cat-and-mouse game of frequencies began, and the British, with the offensive initiative, always stayed one step ahead. 2. The brute force tactic wheeled sow, wild boar. When the technological solution couldn't keep up, the Luftwaffe introduced a new, bold, and desperate tactic, proposed by a famous night fighter pilot, Major Hajo Hermann. It was called wheeled sow, wild boar. The idea was simple and dangerous if the radar was neutralized. Abandon it. Fast single-engine day fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 would be deployed and manually vectored to the target areas. There, they would operate independently, without radar. Pilots would rely on sight the light from the fires on the ground, the searchlight beams, and the light from the British bombers themselves, illuminated in the night. They would plunge into the bomber formations and attack chaotically, like wild boars in a forest. This tactic initially caused some significant losses for the RAF. It was unpredictable and relied on the individual skill of the German fighter pilots. However, it was also extremely risky. The rate of night landing accidents without radar assistance was very high. Furthermore, having German fighters and their own anti-aircraft flak operating in the same airspace without coordination often led to friendly fire, causing casualties to their own side. Wheeled-sow was a temporary solution, an admission that Germany's tightly coordinated air defense system had been defeated. 3. More sophisticated countermeasures, Nuremberg and SN2. Eventually, the Germans found a more long-term technological solution. They developed a new version of radar for their night fighters, called Liechtenstein SN2. This radar operated on a wider frequency band and was harder for window to jam. At the same time, they implemented a technique called Nuremberg instead of trying to scan the entire sky. Night fighters would be voice-guided by ground stations close to the target area, and only then would they turn on their SN2 radar to lock on to the final target at close range, where the signal of the real bomber was much stronger than the interference from window. The electronic war had now become a complex game of technological chess. Each move by one side prompted a counter-move from the other. The British, recognizing the SN2 as a new threat, developed a new version of window called Window 2, designed specifically to target the SN2's frequency band. They also began using dedicated jamming aircraft, like the de Havilland Mosquito variant equipped with the Jostle device, which could broadcast powerful active jamming signals. The introduction of window had not ended the air war. It had transformed it into a more intense technological duel than ever before. And while engineers on both sides struggled to gain the electronic advantage, an urgent question remained for the British High Command. Would their initial fear become a reality? When would the Germans strike back with this weapon themselves? Deodorant legacy of the Silver Storm, the trade-off and the victory. While the electronic war over Germany continued with increasing intensity, leaders in London still harbored fears of a retaliatory attack using the very weapon they had unleashed. That fear of blowback did become a reality, but not in the way they had imagined. It didn't come from a massive bombing raid, but from a smaller, more persistent, and psychologically fatiguing threat, the V-1 flying bombs. In June 1944, Germany launched its V-1 Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1 missile attacks against London. These buzz bombs immediately tested Britain's air defense system. And just as predicted, only a few weeks after the V-1 campaign began, British radar operators started seeing familiar phenomena on their screens, chaotic clouds of blips. The Germans had finally deployed their Doppel to protect the V-1s, trying to hide them in a sea of false targets. But here, British preparation paid off, because they were the pioneers of this technique. Their scientists and engineers were also the first to develop countermeasures. They quickly adjusted their radar filters and developed new techniques to distinguish between the signal of a real V-1, a fast, continuously moving target, and the foil strips which moved slower and drifted with the wind. Although Germany's Doppel caused some initial difficulties, it never achieved the devastating effectiveness that Britain's window had against the German system. The hard lesson of Hamburg had given the British the time and motivation to prepare, and they were ready. The strategic trade-off, the price of victory. In the end, British strategists had to face the tough question, was the use of window worth the price? The answer, when analysed coldly after the war, was a resounding yes. Reduced RAF casualties, this was the most direct and obvious benefit. It is estimated that window helped reduce the casualty rate of bomber crews by about 25–30% for the remainder of the war. That equated to tens of thousands of airmen saved, who, without window, might never have returned home. Every one of those lives was a testament to its success. Increased bombing effectiveness. By neutralizing Germany's air defenses, window allowed Bomber Command to focus on more accurate bombing, as accurate as was possible at the time, instead of having to perform chaotic evasive maneuvers. This increased the devastation wrought on Germany's war industry, forcing the enemy to expend resources. The race to counter window cost Germany an enormous amount of time, money, and intellectual resources that could have been used to develop new fighter planes or offensive weapons. It forced them from an offensive posture into a defensive one. The price paid, the risk and reality of Germany's Doppel use was proven to be manageable. Britain's air defense system adapted and remained effective. The strategic trade-off, in the end, was entirely worth it. The eternal legacy, the birth of modern electronic warfare. The most important legacy of window was not just the lives it saved or the damage it inflicted on the enemy, but that it gave birth to an entirely new field of combat electronic warfare, EW. The Silver Storm over Hamburg proved eloquently that battles were fought not only with bombs and bullets, but also with microwave pulses and radio signals. The simple principles that window applied in 1943 are still the foundation of electronic warfare today. Chaff, the modern name for window, still used by every modern air force as a standard defensive measure to protect fighter jets, bombers, and even warships. Flares developed on the same principle, using heat to deceive infrared-guided missiles. Active jamming, a direct evolution from devices like Jostle, where powerful radio signals are broadcast to swamp enemy radar and communication systems. Every time a modern F-35 fighter jet releases chaff to deceive an enemy air defense system, it is using a sophisticated version of the foil strips that a brave group of British scientists and a decisive Prime Minister once gambled on an uncertain future. The story of window is not the story of a superweapon, but a story of intellectual innovation, of the courage to accept strategic risks, and of how a simple, almost crude solution could tip the balance of a high-tech war. It reminds us that, sometimes, the greatest breakthroughs come not from incomprehensible complexity, but from a deep understanding of the most basic principles and the courage to use them in ways no one had ever imagined. And on that fateful night in Hamburg, it was those flimsy strips of foil that became the silent but incredibly powerful weapon that helped thousands of soldiers return home and opened a new chapter in the art of war.